15.1 is an introduction to square roots. These problems here in chapter 15, at least for the first section, are going to be relatively straightforward. If you notice, all we're doing is we're looking to find the square root. Okay. So the square root of 16, an easy way to think about doing this is if you look at your multiplication table, all the numbers that I have here along the diagonal, these are numbers that we call perfect squares. So the square root of 16 is going to be 4, simply for the reason that 4 times 4 gives me the number 16, right? So the square root of 16 is just 4. The square root of 64 is 8. When I have a fraction, I'm going to think about this in two parts. I'm going to think about this as what is the square root of 1 divided by the square root of 25. Well, the square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 25 is 5. So the square root of 1 over 25 is just 1/5. Okay. And do the same thing here. I'll think about that as the square root of 1, over the square root of 64. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 64 is 8. Okay. Continuing here, the square root of 9, I'm going to think about this in two pieces. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 81 is 9. You scroll down a little bit. Okay, I want you to take a look at the next two problems. And the first thing I notice about these next two problems is that we have some negatives here. So this problem here says we're looking for the negative square root of 36. I want to think about it like this. Well, I already know the square root of 36 is going to be 6. So then the negative square root of 36 is just going to be negative 6. So when we did the very first problem today and we said, okay, what was the square root of 16? We said the square root of 16 was 4, because when I looked at my table, I know that 4 times 4 gives me the number 16, right? So again, if I'm thinking about that, the reason why the square root of 16 is 4 is because 4 times 4 gives me 16. The same thing with this problem. The reason the square root of 64 is 8 is because 8 times 8 gives me 64. So when I look at the last problem that I have here on this page, and it's asking me, can I find the square root of negative 4? What I'm asking myself here, what's different from this problem to the one that we just did, is the negative, if you notice, is on the inside of my square root, where the negative here was on the outside. I'm asking myself, what number, when I multiply it by itself, is going to give me a negative 4? Well, suppose I thought the answer was negative 2. So I would have to take negative 2 times negative 2, but that would give me a positive 4. And if I thought it was 2, well, 2 times 2 also gives me a positive 4. The numbers have to be the same. So if you might be thinking, well, what about negative 2 times positive 2? Those numbers there are actually different. One's negative, one's positive. That does give me negative 4, but the numbers have to be the same. So when we have the square root of negative 4, what we say here, this is not a real number. Okay. It's not that there's no solution, but we say there's not a real number. And in chapter 7, we're going to talk about how do we take the square root of things like negative 4. Okay. So let me scroll down a little bit more. Okay, so now the next problem here says find each root, assume all variables represent non-negative numbers. Again, I want us to think about some of these numbers. Like if I were to ask you, what's the square root of 49? We would say that number is 7. And the reason why it's 7 is because when I take 7 times 7, I get 49. I want you to notice how many 7s we have to multiply. We have to multiply the number 7 twice. The square root means I'm grouping in pairs, okay? So I'm going to sort of show you the long version and then I'll show you the shortcut, but I want to show you the long version so you understand why the answers are going to work out the way they're going to work out. So if you notice here, I have y to the 10th. So guys, remember what that really means. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's right, I just wrote 10 y's for y'all. Okay, remember, we're grouping in terms of 2, right? Just like we had 2 7s to give me 49, I'm going to start pairing them up. So if I come back over here, say, look, that's 1 pair of y's, that's 2 pair of y's, That's 3 pair of y's. There's 4 pair of y's. There are 5 pairs of y's. So here my answer would be y to the 5th. And I said, okay, how would I make sure that I'm doing that right? Well, I could say y to the 5th times another y to the 5th is the same thing as y to the 10th. Since the square root means that we're grouping in terms of the number 2, really what I'm thinking here, guys, is that I'm going to take my exponent, which is the number 4, and I'm going to divide it by 2, because I'm getting pairs. So 2 goes into 4 2 times, nice and neat. So here my answer would just be x squared, because we got a 2. Okay. Let's try the next one here. I'm going to think about this as 2 problems. I'm going to think about that as the square root of 9 times the square root of x to the 8th. Well, we already know the square root of 9 is 3. Again, now I'm going to take my number 8, because that's my exponent. I'm going to divide it by 2. That goes in 4. So this would now be 3x to the 4th. Okay. Excuse me. I'm going to continue with that same process. The square root of 36 is 6. If I take my exponent of 12 and divide it by 2, I also get 6. So that would be 6x to the 6th. Again, if you're wondering, how can I make sure I really did this right? Well, I could take 6x to the 6th times another 6x to the 6th, and that's going to give me 36x to the 12th. Okay. All right. Let's continue here. The square root of 81 is 9. If I take my exponent, which is 2, and I divide it by 2, I'm just going to end up with 1, so one of the x's, right? Okay. Remember, again, all I'm doing is I'm taking my exponents and I'm dividing them by 2. Okay. So let's take our exponents. Let's divide them by 2. That should give me x to the 6th and y to the 10th. Let's take a look at the next one that I have here. All right, I'm going to do it again in pieces. The square root of 16 is 4. The square root of 8 to the 6, 6 divided by 2 is 3. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay. The square root of 4 is 2. 14 divided by 2 is 7. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so there's one of the ends, right? Again, I'm just doing this thing here in pieces. X to the 6th. If I take my 6 and divide it by 2, x to the 3rd. 36, the square root is 6. Okay. Y to the 8th, the square root would be y to the 4th. And the square root of 49 is just 7. Okay. All right, so that's 15.1.